Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Benga Aborowa. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the security happenings on the continent of Africa. Welcome to the program. But before we get on with the main topic for today, let me bring you the security headlines. 2 more Chibok girls freed in Nigeria more than 8 years since the abduction. The Norwegian Refugee Council declares the Democratic Republic of Congo situation as the world's most neglected refugee crisis. And gunmen behead and abduct a politician in southeast Nigeria. And in Mozambique, the police have detained 5 Somali nationals suspected of being members of a kidnapping and drug trafficking network. Don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. At least 7 people have been killed, 4 of them beheaded in recent jihadist attacks in northeastern Mozambique. Violence that is now affecting areas previously relatively untouched and causing massive new displacement. The armed groups had been operating mainly in the far northeast of the poor but resource-rich Cabo Delgado province near the border with Tanzania. The violence has also caused a humanitarian crisis among the displaced population. We have more details for you in this package.
In 2010, the largest natural gas reserves in sub-Saharan Africa were discovered in Mozambique. This was the beginning of bigger expectations for the oil-rich nation as it dared to dream about the future. More than a decade later, the great ambition of boosting the country's economy from its abundance of oil and gas is stalled as Mozambique finds itself in the grips of a devastating insurgency. Since 2017, when terrorists fired a first salvo, more than 4,000 have been killed in the country, and current figures estimate that around 800,000 Mozambicans have been displaced. Worried about the situation in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province and its ripple effect on the southern African region, several African countries came together to build a 3,100-strong army to stop the insurgents. While the first has been able to hold ground, the attacks continue. Renewed terrorist attacks in Cabo Delgado province has led to residents fleeing their homes, with more than 10,000 fleeing for safety in the last 1 week. The $20 billion Total Energies project projected to boost the nation's economy has been abandoned. More and more people are being displaced, and the insurgency is taking a toll on Mozambique and its people. How much can this oil-rich country take? Where did the insurgency come from? What's the way forward?
Now, joining me on the program today to discuss this and more, we have Jasmine Opperman. She is a private consultant in violent extremism in Southern Africa. I also have from Maputo, Mozambique, Professor Adriana Nvunga. Is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Democracy and Development. I also have joining me from Nairobi, Kenya, Piers Pigu, Senior Consultant, International Crisis Group for Southern Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Secure the Continent. Happy to have you all join me here today.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with Professor Nvunga. Prof, the conflict in Cabo Delgado has been ongoing since October 2017. What is the genesis of this conflict? Who started it?
Thank you very much. Good evening. Much has been said about the genesis of this conflict. In our view, although the conflict has attracted people from different parts of Africa, but it is mainly domestic. Domestic in the sense that after almost a decade of discovery of massive gas reserves, nothing has happened in terms of improving the livelihoods of the people. And prior to this, because the region is also rich in minerals, there has been elite-centric extractivism underpinned by violations of human rights, and also negated opportunities for people to benefit of these wealth. So there's been neglect, there's been marginalization, there's been elite-centric extractivism, which fueled, in a number of cases, brutality and violation of human rights. And the discovery of these gas reserves, it has sparked the perspectives of people improving their livelihoods. But nothing of this has happened. With this considered, that region is also underpinned by networks of illicit economy, including organized crime, which to some extent, it creates a sense of competition in terms of access to big money by the networks. So the organized crime, it competes with the economic opportunities existing there. So some of these people, they do not have the hurry that we have to harness from these resources, because they have access to illicit economies and organized crime. So this is the context within which the conflict is taking place. And to some extent, it explains why, after an initial success military intervention from Rwanda Defense Force and SAMIM, which is the Southern Africa SADC deployment to Mozambique, the insurgency is not contained, because it has local roots, which speaks to local dynamics, including elements of ethnicity.
Thank you very much, Professor Navunga. I'd like to bring in Piers here. Piers, Professor Navunga did talk about these underlying conditions like poverty and neglect from the government in Maputo as being one of the reasons why we're seeing an uptick, in spite of the SAMIM's efforts and also the Mozambican forces. Now, my question to you is, the last few months has seen a significant uptick in the number of attacks that has taken place in the southern districts of the Cabo Delgado province. 2 days ago, there were reports of another attack in Nampula province, southern border of Cabo Delgado. What is responsible for this uptick in violence that we're seeing recently?
Well, it's important to remember that since the intervention by both Rwanda and SAMIM forces in July last year, there's been significant progress in degrading certain elements of the capacity of the insurgent groups. No one really knows just how many insurgents have been captured or killed and so forth. But what we've seen in a couple of instances, and this in some ways accounts for the shift south, is that in response to more aggressive offences in the centre of the province, in Makumia district, by the Rwandans who were deployed there in late March, early April, it appears that several groups of insurgents have pushed south, away from this offensive into those southern districts. Now, those districts have not been affected by violence in the way that we've seen in 5 or 6 of the more northerly districts of the province. So this has created a certain amount of panic, particularly because these are the districts which are the most densely populated districts of the province, and also hosting significant numbers of IDPs in that area. Now, some people are saying this is a deliberate tactic to open up or to explore the opening up of a new front. An attempt was made in November and December last year to explore opening up a new front, again in the wake of offensives by international forces with Mozambican forces in Niassa, the province to the immediate west of Cabo Delgado. And that kind of, it was a small group that went up there, but that petered out after a couple of months. It may well be that there isn't capacity to sustain this kind of offensive heading south, but quite clearly there's a terror tactic in play. They're largely avoiding confrontation with the security forces who are very reactive. And at one level, it's been tactically successful in generating a certain amount of panic. As in your intro, you indicated the large numbers of IDPs, internally displaced, that have been moved in those areas. And this has also acutely affected humanitarian supply networks as well for the time being.
Now, Piers, we understand that despite being under severe military pressure, the insurgency is surviving. Many Al-Shabaab fighters,
yes,
like you rightly said, have simply resumed living amongst the civilian population or dispersed into areas that had not seen conflict before. So how are the military planners dealing with this new dimension of the conflict? Because they're going to new places, opening new fronts, and that's a problem in itself.
No, it's a significant challenge for the security forces, who themselves are operating the coherence of the security response from the different forces in northern Mozambique is of some concern, because they seem to remain in very much a reactive mode. We see that they are also operating still in areas where we're not seeing attacks, and they're very thinly spread. I mean, you spoke about 3,100. In fact, there are about 5,000 foreign troops supporting and police supporting the Mozambicans. But this is over a large terrain, very difficult terrain for counterinsurgency, and particularly with the SAMIN and the FADM forces, and ill-equipped with respect to pursuing a hard security strategy. And the one area that we see in particular in that is the fundamental lack of air cover and air assets in play to pursue this kind of counterinsurgency strategy, which I think is going to become much more difficult in the southern provinces. Now, Professor Navunga referred to social bases.
Yes.
And in the south, this is a big question. To what extent will these groups be able to rely on support from local communities in terms of local reprovisioning, or will they have to maintain a campaign of terror against the population in order to be able to resupply and so forth? So we're in very uncertain territory at the moment.
Thank you, and I'm happy you mentioned the social grievances. That's why I'm bringing back Professor Navunga. Now, Professor, some analysts have posited that the worsening crisis in northern Mozambique is a classical case study of why governance matters. Poverty and unemployment are rampant in Cabo Delgado. How much of this conflict is driven by those social grievances, and how much of a contributory factor is it to recruitment of terrorists in the region?
Thank you very much. As Piers has indicated, there is little knowledge about the composition of the group. The reality, though, is that the start of the insurgency, to some extent, it was associated with a number of events, including how the resettlement has taken place to pave the way for the LNG explorations in the two Duarte districts, namely Palma and Mocimboa da Praia, which it has been the epicenter of the violent extremism. This is one aspect, but we have also to consider how the response at the early stage of the insurgency, the response was disastrous in terms of further violations of human rights and targeting of civilians by air, by helicopter, and non-clearly distinguishing militaries and civilians.
So they're part of the collateral damage.
Exactly. That has also fueled anger in a much larger context where these areas we're talking about, just to give an example, Mocimboa da Praia, the first secondary school in Mocimboa da Praia, it was built in 2007.
Wow.
This was 3 years prior the discovery of gas in that area. This also, it tells you about the social fabric in that area. Without proper schooling, what then drive the social fabric in that area? Clearly,
Professor Navunga, why is the central government in Maputo so disconnected from these areas? I mean, they're part of Mozambique. So why aren't they getting necessarily support and the infrastructure and social services that they deserve?
True. One aspect that needs to be understood is that since the signing of the peace agreement in 1992, the much expected peace dividend did not occur, or it was not inclusive to the larger majorities of the population, mainly those that are far from the capital city, which is in the south. This is one aspect. The other aspect that needs to be considered is that the area that we are talking about, it was the area where 30 years ago, the first cargo of drug trafficking, it was discovered. It was discovered there not because the police was active in seizing it, but there was an accident and the drug was stranded in the banks of the ocean. It was discovered there. Since then, there hasn't been an explanation of these networks of drug trafficking, of organized crime. But research has shown that that area, it is the entry point of illicit economy, drug trafficking, which intersects important sectors of the Mozambique police sector.
Now, Professor, if you let me, I'd like to bring in Jasmine here. Now, Jasmine, thanks for joining us. What's the current situation? I remember speaking to you offline. You did say there were 4 attacks in the last 24 hours in the northern Mozambique. Not a very pretty picture and situation there. Hello, Jasmine, are you there?
We have seen 3 attacks back in Mocamia.
Okay, I'd like to come to Pierce. I believe our engineers are working on getting Jasmine online. Now, Pierce, 4 attacks in the last 24 hours. Since July last year, more than 5,000 soldiers, as you rightly said, have been deployed from Rwanda and the Southern African Development Community contingent known as the Southern African Mission in Mozambique, SAMIM, to help the beleaguered Mozambican army smoke out this militants. Why are these attacks still taking place despite the military gains recorded by the SADC Intervention Force and the Rwandan Defense Forces? You did allude to some of these gains earlier in your opening statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're dealing with is a reconfiguration of the way the insurgents are operating and surviving at the moment. There are varying developments in play. In some parts of the districts, We've seen that insurgents have been extremely hard pressed by the impact of the intervention. This has been a very lean period. It's a period where there has not been a lot of food, and a number of insurgents have simply surrendered. They've given up some of their hostages as well because they can no longer feed these people, and they're in a pretty bad way. In other areas, they appear to be demonstrating some kind of resurgence, and one hopes we get Jasmine back on the line because we can talk about this uptick, particularly following Ramadan, where the Mozambique chapter, so to speak, of Islamic State became a more formal presence, and we've seen a rash of the attacks over the last 6 to 8 weeks, which have been claimed by Islamic State. I think over 22, 23 claims, which raises questions and concerns about, the direction in which this is going at the moment. These are smaller groups operating. They're no longer in, whereas we saw some of the big coordinated attacks previously, which may include over 100 fighters. These are smaller groups operating in groups of between 5 and 15, 20. We're aware of one group which is at least 30 or 40 that is operating. But we don't know how many of these guys have essentially demobilized and infiltrated back into the communities.
Piers,
so they're on a
central
kind of survival
command
mission. The government narrative is, we've got them on the run. But the reality is you may have them on the run, but a lack of intelligence and capacity is enabling them to continue terrorizing and causing the panic that we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Now, Piers, when we see this Al-Shabaab insurgents operate in different cells, are they under a central command or they're acting independently?
Well, this goes to Professor Nabunga's point about our understanding or limited understanding of exactly how the insurgents are operating in terms of command structure. There was an understanding from a number of analysts that prior to the intervention, there were 3 major battle groups that were operating in the north, the center, and the south of the province, that they had a level of coordination, could come together for major attacks, and were in communication in one way or another. The feeling was initially following the intervention was that those communication channels were broken, and we saw, at least in terms of Islamic State messaging, that there was a breakdown in any kind of messaging out of Cabo Delgado for about 4 months, and then suddenly they picked up again. Yes. Question is, are these groups still in contact with one another at the moment? And there is a suggestion that the attacks that we've seen in the south are in some way perhaps coordinated with simultaneous attacks that have been taking place in the center, in Makomia district, and in the north, Nangadi district, also during the same period. And we're seeing claims for attacks in those areas also from Islamic State. So there is a sense that there is still some kind of coordination. Now, how that fits into a command structure, of course, is open to question. And we still don't really understand the command council and the nature of the command council and its relationship to the insurgents on the ground. It's also important to remember that many of the young people that joined this group and may have joined for material reasons on the basis of promises of money and so forth, have also been subjected in a number of these areas and camps to radicalization program. So this is a moving target in terms of the qualitative nature of the challenge, both in terms of the hard security challenge, but the longer term human security challenges.
Almost which like a cat and mouse game, if you ask me. Now I'd like to bring in Jasmine. I hope Jasmine is here with us. Hello, Jasmine.
Good evening, and good evening.
Okay, nice to have you, Jasmine. It's been almost a year since the SADC intervention force and the Rwandan forces came into Mozambique. What's the situation like today? In your own assessment, is the situation any better? And because we're witnessing attacks. Even yesterday, like you mentioned to me, there were 4 attacks. What's your general assessment of the SADC intervention?
If one looks at the current momentum, the intervention from foreign forces are being done in silos. There's a lack of coordination, a lack of trust, and also a lack of interest at political level at play. And we have to be clear on this. We are seeing an insurgency in momentum as we have seen prior 3 years back when they started attacking district capitals. Now, peers have noted they are not that big anymore. They will not be that big anymore. They're adjusting to the environment. And the problem is the security force intervention cannot keep up. These smalls are spreading their capabilities. It's spreading their time duration for deployment, and they know it's a question of time before these forces will have to withdraw. And that is what the insurgents are waiting for. The Islamic State has run 3 Al-Naba main articles on Africa calling for Hijra, for its members to come to Africa, specifically Nigeria. And the problem is in Cabo Delgado, we are seeing an Islamic State footprint evolving, with the Islamic State Mozambique claiming to credit now 24 claims to credit in just over a month. We have to be serious about what is happening.
Now,
we
talking about being serious, sorry for interrupting you, Jasmine. Being serious, are you proposing an increase in the military intervention and the numbers? Because right now we're dealing with around 5,000 forces, and there are also people that worry about Mozambique's sovereignty. Are you calling for an Iraqification type of, a troop boost, if you may have it, to deal with this situation?
No, I am not calling for that. To the opposite. If I look at the military intervention, and you've nailed it with the concept Iraqification, that is the last thing we want in Cabo Delgado. And remember, Iraqification also includes the militia groups protecting the communities. I think there needs to be a major mind shift at government level. There needs to be serious consideration of some level of dialogue to take track in Cabo Delgado. It's going to take time, but we cannot rely on the military to solve this problem. This is a clear message where we're sitting tonight. If we want serious problems in the region, it is Iraqification. The military should have only enabled the environment to be able to address the root causes which Professor Adriano referred to. It's not being addressed. What is left? There is only one option I can think of. It's time for a dialogue process, no matter how long it takes, but that will at least provide hope to the people of Cabo Delgado.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'd like to bring in Professor Nvunga. You said a dialogue process, but on the diplomatic front, Mozambique is joining the United Nations Security Council for the first time. Its term will start in 2023. Mozambique is expected to make terrorism a key focus of its two-year term at the United Nations Security Council. My question to you, Professor Nvunga, is this. Will Mozambique's membership of the United Nations Security Council have any significant impact on things on the ground in Mozambique?
Thank you. Well, it will depend on what is exactly going to happen. But if we look at what is happening at the moment, number one, the reluctance for dialogue. There is a reluctance for dialogue. You might have heard President News saying he wants the leaders of those who led the attack in Ankwabe and towards the south to North Nampula. So that is not the language of dialogue. And the UN, it's a dialogue structure. It's not a militaristic structure. So it will depend on whether the government is willing to start to address the root causes in a coordinated way. The humanitarian response, which needs to be boosted. There is now a new wave of humanitarian crisis that is not properly being dealt with. There is an issue of development. And this is a rooted issue of decades of inequality, decades of elites benefiting without development for local populations. There are also issues around marginalization and also instrumentalization of the youth by those who are positioned at the top in terms of using the young people for illicit economy, including using the much needed state capacity to protect civilians, but rather to protect the interest of the powerful people. So it will depend on whether the government is willing to walk the talk of dialogue, of starting to listen communities, because there are issues that have to do with the communities that are not properly at that very local level at peace with the state. Remember, I've talked about the issue of much larger peace dividend, which did not benefit the majority of the population. I gave the example of Mosimbo da Praia, where the first secondary school, it was built in 2007. This tells you of how much the neglect looks like in that region, which only became known in the map because massive gas reserves were found out there.
Okay, Professor Navunga, a good place to hold your thoughts. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll start looking at solutions and what should be done to address the to stem the insurgency in Mozambique's northern Cabo Delgado region. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Secure the Continent. We're still discussing stemming the insurgency in Mozambique's northern Cabo Delgado province. I still have with me Jasmine Opperman, Professor Adriana Navunga, and Piers Pigu. Now, Piers, talking about finding solutions to this problem in Cabo Delgado. Last year, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced an additional list of specially designated global terrorists, 5 terrorist leaders operating in Africa. And this list included the senior commander of the Islamic State affiliate in Mozambique, Machude Omar. My question to you is, what are the practical consequences of this announcement, and in what other way? Because I know we're pushing Africa's solutions to Africa problems. We've seen the Southern Africa Development Community Intervention Force and the Rwandans. They've been doing a fairly good job, but in what ways, apart from, putting up a list of terrorist commanders and blacklisting them, can the United States help the situation in Mozambique?
How the designation assists the situation.
Yes.
I mean, it certainly provided some space for government to pursue a narrative that this was primarily about some kind of external factor that was driving this insurgency. And I think there are some questions about that as it relates to the internal causes and drivers that Professor Navunga has spoken about. I think the immediate practical challenge relates to the security situation and the capacity of the existing forces to coordinate effectively to be able to have a coherent counterinsurgency strategy. But this is not a long-term solution, even in terms of hard security. We're already seeing that both the Rwandan force and the SADC force are looking for external funding. The interesting thing about the SAMIN force is that it is the first time that an African force has completely self-financed for this kind of operation on the continent. And that's an important step in some respects, but it is trying to pursue counterinsurgency on the cheap, as I indicated earlier. The Rwandans also are claiming they're spending $1 million a day on their deployment there, and they can't continue this in the long run.
The European Union for assistance too. The Rwandan Defense Forces have asked the European Union for financial assistance.
As have the SADC forces, Gubenga. They both asked, but the amount of money that's going to be made available through the European Peace Facility is simply not going to cover the costs that either the Rwandans or SADC actually want. They're not going to have that. The Europeans are already spending and allocated 89 million euros to trying to train up a rapid reaction unit in the Mozambican security forces, where they will train over the next 2 years 2,000 troops. It's 11 companies of 200, so 2,200 troops. The question is whether they would be able to really take over the hard security role. But the bigger challenge is the human security issues, which relate to dealing with these underlying causes, building, rebuilding, or building from scratch the pillars of state in Mozambique, and a much more inclusive approach. And there's really some question about the strategic plans that are in place and the bandwidth for the Mozambican state to drive this, particularly when at the heart of this are challenges of governance that go beyond the Cabo Delgado arena and are national challenges. So there's a sense that we are in for a long haul here because the underlying push and pull factors that have fed into this insurgency are not going to be adequately addressed in the short term, and that presents a serious problem moving forward.
Thank you, Piers. I would like to bring in Jasmine here. Piers has just painted a not too pretty picture, because it seems what has been done so far, looking at the scale of the problem, is merely just cosmetic. Now, Jasmine, according to the United Nations and the NGO Save the Children, on Tuesday, 10,000 people have fled their homes. 10,000 people have fled their homes. And in the past week, so my question to you is this: what are the humanitarian effects of this conflict that has been ongoing for years, and what can be done in the immediate future to improve the plight of these people?
I think the humanitarian crisis is at the center of all the things that's happening now. And if one looks at the feedback from people in IDP camps and their dissatisfaction, and from there on, with those moving back, immediately encountering fears of possible attacks, and then also the lack of trust in the Mozambican military, we are sitting with a vicious cycle of a forgotten Cabo Delgado that is just keep on presenting its long-casting shadows of what's happening in Cabo Delgado. And that has a generational impact. That means we are talking about the young generation that's been brought up in this environment, that's being exposed to this level of violence and starting to accept violence as the only way of putting their or showing their discontent towards government. So I don't believe that it's only de-radicalization that is at play here, but desensitization. But we're going back to Maputo. We're going back to the leverage they have in the short and medium term, but medium and long term, on how to deal with the forgotten Cabo Delgado history. And that is going to take time. But for as long as the humanitarian crisis keeps on presenting itself as the forefront of the insurgency, it's going to be extremely difficult for the government to win the trust of the people of Cabo Delgado. And the question now is, does the government and the region realize the importance of a national security strategy that will feed into a generational solution and not an immediate solution? Short term, we need to sustain this insurgency to the best of what we can. But if we do not engage
military might, is there any way, sorry Jasmine, is there any way you could suspend this insurgency as an immediate solution without applying military solutions?
Just repeat the question, sir. Sorry.
Is there any way the government in Maputo can suspend this insurgency because of its humanitarian consequences without applying military means?
I don't believe it is possible. I think we must realize and we have to recognize the vital role the military has to play at this point in time. The question is, what is that role that they have to play? Chasing insurgents, being reactive all the time, or not even responding to an incident is having a counter message to the people of Cabo Delgado, that they're not serious about the task at hand, that they're not responding, that they're not protecting. So communities are going to become self-reliant on security, and then militarization starts evolving at a non-state level. Hence, if we need the security, we need the military, but repackage and rethink the way it's being done now. It's silo interventions. And I'm sorry to say, the EU training interventions are not going to make a difference if it's not integrated in a coherent strategy, which is sadly lacking.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Professor Nvunga, Rwandan forces now occupy the coast of Palma City past Masimbwa the Prior, as well as areas to the west near the important towns of Mudumbe and Mweda. Have the local population that fled these areas, have they been able to return?
There's been some movements of people returning. Starting from the state machinery that was kind of forced to return to show some sort of state presence there. And the governor recently said their local population is returning, but the reality is that it is not yet safe for local populations to return. There have been areas that were initially liberated, so to say, but in the recent waves of the attacks, they were affected. And this, as Jasmine was saying, it poses a serious question as to the capacity of the state after the violent extremists being weakened by the joint forces intervention, the state capacity to come in and secure those areas, secure it from a law and order perspective. This is key. If we are to win this, we need a Mozambique defense force, Mozambique police to come in from the law and order enforcement perspective to make sure that it is present. From what we have seen in the recent wave of the attacks towards the south and then to Nampula, that is clearly an issue of law and order.
Now, Professor Nvunga, do the Mozambican security apparatus, do they have the capacity to do that in their current composition?
Clearly, at the moment, no. If you look at what happened in Ankwabe, in a period of 15 days, they attacked it 3-4 times. This clearly tells you a number of things, including poor intelligence, number one. Number two, the real capacity to enforce law and order. This is not yet there. The EU training might be an important contribution to that. But you also need a situation where when the local populations, they whistle the blow, they share some information, it is collected, it is processed in a workable manner. That is not yet happening. And you cannot win a violent extremist organization if your intelligence is not able to work with the early signs, process it in a workable manner.
Yeah, because what we get these days is that the security officials arrive after an attack. I mean, to do what? Yeah, so you have a point there in coordinating intelligence and being less reactive. Now, before we run out of time, I'd like to bring in Piers. Piers, if this conflict continues to get out of hand and spirals out of control, what are the ramifications for the region?
Well, I think this is a huge question because, I mean, the salmon intervention is predicated on the threat to the region and to help support Mozambique to address that issue within its territorial boundaries. there are parts of the region where there is beyond Mozambique, but also in Mozambique, where there's a fear there could be a spread in terms of radicalization and recruitment, both in terms of south into the province of Nampula, north into areas of Tanzania, which has its own radicalization issues and which is connected, as Professor Navungo was pointing out when he was talking about the origins. There is a connection there in certain respects, and still is. And we've seen some attacks in southern Tanzania, not anything of significance this year, but over the course of the insurgency. And the possibilities, concerns about linkages to other parts of the region, into Malawi and so forth. But in many respects, it's unclear at this stage whether we would be looking at something which would be consolidating insurgency activity again in northern Mozambique, because we appear to be returning to a situation where even if the gas areas are able to be heavily fortified in some kind of green zone approach, the rest of the province is likely to be subject to some kind of low-intensity conflict for the foreseeable future. And that is the sad kind of scenario, or one of the predictable scenarios that seems to be in play at the moment. So, I mean, I don't think we're looking at a massive expansion of terrorist activity in southern Africa at this stage. But if they get hold of a base and are able to secure a base or a more permanent base in that area, that does have acute, severe repercussions for the rest of the region.
Thank you, Piers. Now, Jasmine, the Mozambican president, Filipe Nyusi, says it plans to invest over $1 billion in the country's northern region, moving away from military solutions. It says it's a $100 million emergency program to support health and education. What's the status of this investment, and is it ongoing?
Looks at the breakdown of the program. Most of those, or the financial resources, will be allocated to the NDP, to Mozambique, Praia, and to Palma. That tells a story in itself. And I think Piers just referred to it. It is this focus on the Duat's areas. It's this focus and this false illusion that securing the Duats will secure the LNG sectors. There's more at play here than the LNG sector. Yes, they are important for the region, but there's an insurgency that is embedding itself. There's a humanitarian crisis feeding the insurgency, and it's time to realize that if we do not address Cabo Delgado in its totality, we will not deal with the threat that it poses to the region. We cannot just focus on Mozambique, Praia, and Palma. Insurgents have withdrawn from those two areas. Those were the low-hanging fruits which made it easy for Rwanda to move in.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. Professor Navunga, I'd like to have the last words before we wrap things up. In less than a minute, if you can, could negotiations pave the way out of this insurgency, and what will it take to stabilize Cabo Delgado? Can you sketch us a path to get Mozambique out of this conflict?
What we need is dialogue, a community level type of dialogue, starting from that, and in a bottom-up approach, going up to understand, have a granular understanding what exactly the issue is. There are international ramifications, but this is a domestic issue that needs to be understood. Failing to do so, we will have an intractable type of conflict, because there is also a pressure to move in and to start the exploration in the ways that Jasmine and Piers have talked about, where we think that by securing the Duat area, everything will be fine. It will not be fine. This will lead to intractable kind of conflict. Dialogue is inclusive dialogue is what is needed, starting from community level, community leaders, religious leaders of various nature, coming up and having a granular understanding of what the issues are. It's about governance.
Thank you very much for your time and contributions to the program, Jasmine Opperman, Professor Adriana Nvunga, and Piers Pigu. It was nice having you join us to discuss the situation in Cabo Delgado. Thank you. Now, Rwandan and Southern African troops have helped authorities fight an Islamist insurgency in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique's northernmost province. The threat has greatly lowered, but not yet gone. Maputo will need more military assistance as well as a nudge to address the conflict's political roots. Mozambique's African partners should also press Maputo to open dialogue involving political elites to set conditions that might persuade insurgents to surrender. While donors scale up aid in the province, the African Union should also facilitate regional cooperation to dismantle the insurgency's transnational networks and seek more funds to sustain military operations. Until next time, remember to stay safe and join us and secure the continent. I'm Benga Aboroa.